Welcome everybody to Innovation Economics, episode 2. Innovation Economics is Startup Tucson's new series focused on sharing entrepreneurship is so critical for economic development. What we as a community can do to set startups up for success. Each month we'll invite a national thought leader to join us and share the work they're doing to support all types of entrepreneurs and local economies across the nation. Ideas and use them as inspiration for policy and programs here in Tucson. So, background for anybody that doesn't, it's an economic development nonprofit that's working to support entrepreneurs and startups here in Tucson, Arizona. So my name is Liz Pocock. I'm the CEO of Startup Tucson. The rest of the Startup Tucson team is here. Kanisha, our program manager, and Sophia, our program coordinator. And Dre, introduction in just a second. For now, please mute your mics. We welcome you to stay on video so that our guest and Dre and I can see your faces and see your reactions. It's more personal. If you need to get your lunch, no worries. And if you have questions to the chat as you have them, we'll go ahead and go through those after we're done with our kind of round table and call on you to actually ask your questions to Jon while he's here today. So with that, I will turn it over to Dre to introduce our speaker.
Okay, hello everyone. And I don't know if it was just me. I was having a little trouble hearing Liz, so
it was choppy for everybody, Dre.
Okay, great. So I'll just say just a couple of those key points. I caught most of it what you said, Liz, but just to make sure, as you're going through, if you want to put questions in the chat box, we will have an opportunity to ask questions towards the end. Last week we had a little bit more of a presentation. This week is a little bit more of a fireside chat, and I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for today. So this is Jon Atkinson. He was the prior to joining the Idea Village, he was the director of Loyola University Center for Entrepreneurship and Community Development, a visiting assistant professor of management and entrepreneurship at Loyola. He has a very diverse background that also includes experience as a professional investor. He calls himself a recovering banker, a CEO, a CFO, a business advisor, a board member, and strategic consultant. In his years at the helm of the Idea Village, he's really overseen a focus on empowering high growth tech companies. And really this has been central to the New Orleans success and ongoing economic development. And so last week, if you joined in with us, we really talked a lot about kind of the other end of the spectrum. We talked about those small micro businesses, really ground up entrepreneurship. So we're really excited to kind of balance that out with this higher perspective of high growth tech companies, but within the context of sort of an unexpected twist. So New Orleans has been touted recently as kind of the Silicon Valley of the South. I know there's a Silicon Valley of pretty much all sorts of regions, but what's been really exciting about this is the city that's really known for its energy, its tourism, hospitality, has been bringing in a lot of tech companies, and they have been since 2006, the city has lured over 45 high-tech startups and subsidiaries, and has resulted in more than 20,000 jobs. This is actually a little outdated, so it's probably a little more than that. Jon, I'm sure you can tap us into a little bit more about that. But that's where I wanted to kind of contextualize this conversation is I think Tucson, this could be a model that could really work for Tucson. We are a high culture, low cost city. And so I really kind of want to dig in with Jon about his experience. He's been working in economic development and entrepreneurship for years in New Orleans. So that's kind of the backdrop of where I wanted to jump off. Jon, is there any other, I did want to talk a little bit about the Idea Village itself. So what we really found exciting about the Idea Village, really for I think I want to say 20 years, the Idea Village has been a nonprofit working in this space and really the convener of entrepreneurship, and their role within the city has changed as the city's changed, which is again another topic I want to dive into and I think is really interesting and exciting. They run a number of accelerators and their numbers have been absolutely incredible. The amount of entrepreneurs that they serve, the resources they've brought to the area, and also the just amount of hands-on work that they've provided for entrepreneurs. So with that, I wanted to give Jon a little bit of an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the Idea Village and the work that he does there before we hop into our Q&A.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dre. It's a pleasure to be here today and a pleasure to be able to talk with all of you and share a little bit of the best practices and kind of learnings from our ecosystem. As Dre said, I've been at the helm of the Idea Village for right about 2 years. So I started in July of 2018, but have been part of the ecosystem in New Orleans in a number of different capacities for a very long time, really since Hurricane Katrina. And so I've had the opportunity to see this ecosystem grow in a lot of different ways. And I think there are a lot of similarities between what our experience has been and what you're probably experiencing on the ground in Tucson. So looking forward to diving into that. I like interactive presentations, so I would encourage folks, if you have questions, feel free to dive in and we can flesh those out. I would say, just to kind of highlight a couple of things that Dre said, so about us and about the Idea Village. So if you go back to the beginning of our story as an organization, but also the story of New Orleans as an emerging tech hub, you really have this really interesting story about pace of change. And so one of the things that I've seen over the time that I've been here is this, New Orleans, unlike a lot of other places in the country, has had sort of a tremendous moving of the needle over the last 10, 15 years on our attitudes towards embracing risk, on our attitudes towards embracing startups, on this sort of sense of possibility that, yes, we can build high growth companies here. And that pace of change has been really a driving force for this ecosystem. So it's been a very interesting journey going from, in the 99, 2000, when this organization was started, there was not a lot of business activity here. It was a culture that was very adverse to risk. You had this organization was really started out of a group of 5 founders that used to get together at a bar called the Loa Bar, and they would talk about tech ideas. They talk about sort of how to build a web 1.0.com business, and lament on the fact that this industry seemed to be missing, sort of passing by New Orleans, and there was a tremendous amount of opportunity being lost. And so they really got together, initially formed a business plan competition, found a way to sort of focus the business community on this problem, and then started building a network or a coalition of the willing of supporters to build a broader movement. And now, fast forward 20 years later, we have a handful of homegrown companies that are pushing 100 plus 200, 300 employees. We have one company that's approaching $1 billion valuation. That's a real sort of leader in their industry. We have a pretty robust pipeline of early stage companies coming up, proving out different ideas. And I think my charge really has been, how do we build the specialized set of resources around these high growth potential startup companies in order to take this movement that's been building steam over the last 20 years to the next level? And how do we do it in a repeatable and scalable way? Because you can't necessarily be dependent upon the one-offs. If you want to become an emerged ecosystem, you have to have a process and a system for sort of bringing everybody in and bringing them along. And so that's really where we are today. We run a cohort-based accelerator program We just graduated our 2020 cohort. We had 16 companies graduate about a week ago from a really intensive 4-month, turned into, with COVID, 5.5-month acceleration process. Our goal is to take those companies from seed to Series A, where they're graduating, really set up to raise significant capital and to hire people and scale. And then we run a number of other programs that sort of feed the pipeline for that outcome, right? So our North Star outcome is these high growth companies coming out, sort of the small end of the funnel, and then we run programming that sort of keeps that pipeline moving through the larger end of the funnel.
That's great, Jon. How's my audio now? Better? Okay, great. So you gave us a little bit of background of Idea Village and kind of the early growth of it. It's really similar to Startup Tucson's, but we're much earlier, only about 5 years old. So, but I think we share similar roots. Can you talk to us a little bit more around how Idea Village fits into kind of the larger economic development conversation of New Orleans, and how has the city reacted to the idea of startups and this founder-driven model versus the maybe attraction model that's kind of typical of economic development from a large scale, and kind of what's the path been like for your organization and really establishing yourself as a key player in that space?
Great question. So I think a lot of folks that come from the sort of civic side, right, are very accustomed to this attraction-based economic development model. So they understand investing in going out and recruiting a big company that's going to create a lot of jobs. What I spend a lot of my time doing is trying to convince them that if they're going to invest in that activity, which is fundamentally hunting, right? You're going out to find a company to bring in, that you should also invest in the farming activity, which is sort of cultivating your own seeds. And so what we do is fundamentally farming for economic development. And if you don't invest in farming, you're missing a lot of big opportunities to grow the pie, right? Because in order to attract from the outside, you're inherently taking that from somewhere else. And so I think there's an increasing number of flaws being exposed in that traditional economic development model. That is, those and COVID and some of the forces we're experiencing now are accelerating that. If you have a company that has been brought in based on incentives or whatever else, and they're not necessarily deeply rooted in your community, when the going gets tough, those companies have a tendency to flee. We've had an experience of that in New Orleans. One of our big early economic development wins with the attraction for digital jobs was originally GE Capital, then became GE Digital. And GE Digital, about a month and a half ago, at the height of the pandemic, said, we're pulling the plug. Corporate's having trouble. We can't sustain this office in New Orleans. We're out. Whereas Lucid, which is our most successful and recognizable alumni, has had to do some belt tightening, has had to cut back a little bit, but is still here, is making plans to hire in the future, is in a good position to dominate sort of coming out of this crisis. And so I think if you compare those two things next to each other, you have a pretty compelling argument for farming. I would also say, if you think about the numbers, farming is actually a lot cheaper. So, you get a lot of folks that will balk at the risk of, well, I'm going to put this $100,000 or $200,000 into a startup company, and that may go to zero, right? And a lot of those companies are going to fail. But if you take the sort of, the more of the venture capitalist mindset as an economic developer as a sort of civically minded person, and you say, well, if I was willing to put $3 million or $10 million on the table to attract, we'll pick on GE, to attract a GE Digital, if I took that same $10 million and I put it into 30 startups, Would I end up with the same outcomes that I would end up with from a job creation perspective of a GE Digital? I would argue that you would, and you probably will end up with enough sort of bets or chips on the table that you'll end up with multiple outcomes of that size and scope. So I think there's an argument to be made that it's actually cheaper to invest in sort of homegrown companies rather than trying to attract from the outside. But I think the two do actually play hand in hand. So one of the topics I like to talk a lot about, I think we may talk a little bit more about in a minute, is getting to this sort of point that we all want to be in ecosystem creation, where you have this sort of vibrancy that feeds on itself, takes density. And so attraction is a way to short circuit density. It takes a long time to grow these companies. And so if you can attract in the interim, you can attract startups, if you can attract emerging technology companies, if you can attract the sort of adjacent players, you can get to density a lot more quickly.
Okay, there's like a couple places I want to go with this. I do want to touch back to the what you did bring up, which was you know, when the going gets tough. Once in our conversations in the past, you had talked about how you're seeing some parallels between when you were after Hurricane Katrina and the development that you saw, and now with COVID. Are there any kind of lessons that you're learning about the startup economy in these times? You know, when there is economic challenges, are there things that you've learned from that that may be relevant to other communities as well?
Yeah. So I was not here personally during Katrina. I came in the sort of immediate aftermath in 2007, in the middle of the recovery rebuilding period. But that was central to my kind of formation and how I think about things. I think, and my wife was actually here as a volunteer, living in a tent like 3 weeks after Katrina, and so it's kind of a deep part of our family lore. And so I think there are a lot of parallels to what we're seeing today in the Katrina experience. And I hearken back to, there was a time post-Katrina when you could not get back into the city of New Orleans. They were still sort of pumping the water out in some neighborhoods. This was maybe 6-8 weeks after the storm. Everybody knew that the situation on the ground was a mess, that all businesses were going to have to be rebuilt. And you had sort of this blank canvas moment of, how do you want to rebuild this thing going forward? And there was a lot of disagreement, and there were a lot of voices in that conversation. But I think, you know, that moment felt hopeless for a lot of the vast majority of folks. I would say almost everybody. But the decisions that you made at that moment in time ultimately shaped a lot of the things that have happened downstream in very positive ways. And so that initial action, kind of putting one foot in front of the other, was really important. And so when we think about where we are today, we're restarting a big chunk of the economy. I think we have an opportunity to rethink how we do things. And I think we have an opportunity to you know, take some baby steps to design new systems in different ways. And you know, for me and the work that we do, the types of companies that we serve are inherently digitally native, right? Which makes them much more resilient. I think we've also seen in our area, we're an economy that's very dependent on hospitality. So, you know, what is a world with a long-term, pretty negative outlook on travel and hospitality? What does New Orleans look like in that world? And then we're also, you know, our two big industries are hospitality and oil, which aren't necessarily supposed to be correlated, but this event has shown that they're correlated in some ways that we might not have thought about previously. And so if you're looking down the pipe at prolonged downturn in hospitality, prolonged downturn in oil, potentially negative oil prices, very low oil prices for a long period of time, where do you go from there? And I think that's we're going through that soul searching right now. But I can say that I'm thankful that we've, the companies that have been built out of this, the work that we do to date, I'm thankful that they're here because they're some of the first that are able to get back to work. They're the ones that are able to be more sort of aggressive in the crisis. And I think we're laying the groundwork now for what could be a much more substantial investment in diversification of our economy and sort of tackling some of these structural systemic issues that we've known we needed to tackle for a long time.
I love that. I love how you, right now is a time to be really strategic and planful, and that these can have long-term ramifications for your city, all the choices that we're making right now. So super interesting. And kind of building off what you just said, sort of that it is a creative, a very service industry. I think that that's where we see a lot of parallels with Tucson. We are very much a creative town. A lot of, we're a city of gastronomy. Food is very important to our culture. I wanted to talk a little bit about, tease into that sort of the pros and cons of building in a city that's not you're considered traditional tech city, and kind of layering on top of that. So some other cities like San Francisco or Seattle have said, tech companies have actually ripped apart our culture and we don't like that. We don't want to have a tech boom here because it's going to damage the authenticity that was, initially so attractive. So kind of threw you as a curveball that question, but I'm curious if you want to sort of talk about, is there maybe like a new way to develop? And is New Orleans experiencing that, keeping authenticity parallel to tech? Is there intersections why they support each other, creative and tech? So just kind of talking about that topic in general.
I think there's a really wide-ranging question there, and a lot we can talk about. I did have one other thought on Katrina before I kind of take a stab at answering that, which is one of the really cool things that came out of Katrina is that Katrina made everyone an entrepreneur because everything had to be restarted. And so it wove this sort of entrepreneurial idea in the sort of general population's DNA in a way that it wasn't there before. And so, thinking about this moment where we have all of these things that need to be restarted, how do we use that as a call to action around entrepreneurship? And I think there's a lot of really cool stuff that can be done around that. And then sort of transitioning into the sort of question about culture and authenticity, to me, that really is the raw material for entrepreneurship and for startups more generally. I think there are a lot of different models for startups. The Silicon Valley model tends to dominate the headlines and dominate the sort of cultural norms. But I think we are a case study that you can do it in different ways. And just like we were talking about design choices for the economy, I think you can have design choices for your startup community as well. And so one of the things that I really harp on a lot is that we're not building the Silicon Valley model of startups. In particular in a sort of big picture macro sense, we're actually a very bad place to start a B2C technology company, so a business to consumer technology company. If your audience is general public consumers, think Facebook, YouTube, Uber, those types of things where the end user is an individual consumer, we don't necessarily know how to support those things very well. We don't have the people that understand them. We don't have the larger companies here. We don't have the talent base. But if you think about, and if you start that company here, you're probably going to end up in San Francisco and Silicon Valley because that's where the resources are. But the flip side of that is the B2C consumer tech market is pretty mature. We have really major dominant players, Amazon, Facebook, those types of companies have really rolled up most of the interesting opportunities in that space. And so the new things that are getting started are really sort of much more incremental improvements than they were, say, 15 or 20 years ago. But there's a huge frontier where technology can have an influence in other areas that Silicon Valley doesn't understand very well. Think about things like education. Think about sort of civic and legal technology. Think about industrials. Think about energy. Those are all areas that there's going to be, the technology will have an impact. That impact is not yet fully expressed. There are opportunities for startup companies to become dominant players in those industries. And for us, those happen to be some of the things we do fairly well. We have a pretty robust energy and industrial sector. If you want to sell something in the industrial space, your customers are right out your back door in New Orleans, right? We have a story I like to tell a lot. So one of the reasons I don't think there's a lot, I don't think there's a lot of opportunity for technology in City Hall, right? For instance. But if I'm in Silicon Valley and my leading startup companies are Uber and Airbnb that have a very adversarial relationship with City Hall, which is a notoriously adversarial relationship with City Hall, it's hard for me to show up the next day and say, oh, by the way, guys, I'm here to help, right? And I'm going to solve this process problem, this permitting problem, or this, in a way that's, not adversarial. And so, so I think, in New Orleans, we have this, we have sort of the problems and scope and scale of a big city, but we're a relatively small community. And so, it's easier to pilot things. Like we have a startup that we've worked with that uses private sector vehicles to respond to traffic accidents and frees up cops to actually, go do things that police actually have to do. Stuff like that, if it works in New Orleans, it's probably going to work in New York City. It's probably going to work in Los Angeles. And it is a much easier place to try those new things and sort of use this as a pilot lab. So if you think about kind of building on your assets as a community, what you do well, what your people know, who the big customers are in your market that startups could potentially serve, and then really use that creativity and that authenticity and that sort of quirky gene that I think communities like New Orleans and Tucson express as the raw material to say, we know how to think differently, right? And so that's kind of core to our story.
Yeah, I love that. I feel, everybody knows that, social entrepreneurship and startups that are actually solving social problems that could have huge impacts in the community are really underrepresented in sort of these major tech hubs. And we've seen that a lot within startups within Tucson. We have a lot more companies that are trying to address housing, that are trying to address different types of disparities in education and really tackling these large scale social problems. So that's really interesting. That's something that we've seen as well here. Sustainability being a big, huge part of it. Obviously in the desert and New Orleans, the environment's very critical to us right now. Okay, so were there many major tipping points besides kind of what we talked about, Katrina, that you can think of, particularly in terms of policy or culturally, that sort of got at that shift in mindset that has really helped you significantly help startups in your community? You had mentioned previously there was a mindset that was sort of anti-startups or entrepreneurship. So other than Katrina, are there other moments or policies that were really significant in impacting your ability to really level up the tech sector?
Yeah. So I think the most critical moment is really being able to get to one or two clear wins. That once you can point to one or two companies to say this is possible, it opens up everything behind it. And so I see a lot of folks that go out with these sort of very broad-based efforts, and they're trying to cultivate, hundreds of companies. My experience has been, particularly at the beginning, you got to kind of put your eggs in one or two baskets and really drive them across the finish line. And so, getting that first win is critical. Telling that story, engaging the people around that company or sort of group of folks and sort of paying it forward is huge. I think it's from a policy perspective, I would say the policy environment that we have around startups is good, but it's not great, right? It could be better. We've had a lot of success with the digital media tax credit that also encompasses software work. That's been a very popular incentive. It's helped us sort of hack the density issue with attraction of companies, and it's helped some of our smaller companies. But it's a little more complicated than it needs to be to help the sort of earliest, smallest group of companies. We have an angel investor tax credit that has been somewhat helpful, but is not consistently funded. And so it's sort of a rolling basis. If there's money in the pot that will go out. I would say those have been helpful in kind of maintaining momentum, but have not necessarily been kind of breakthrough things. I think it really is about getting to the small set of outcomes that create belief, right? And whether that be attraction or that is sort of a homegrown company that the community can really get behind, that is usually the first step. And so the first thing that you see. Ours actually, ironically, if I think back, our probably breakthrough company that made everybody believe it was possible ended up failing. It didn't actually work. They kind of overextended themselves, but it convinced everybody that it could happen if you played your cards a little bit differently. And so I think it actually had that desired impact, whether the company worked or not.
That's great. So that you were able to see the momentum,
Yeah.
and then whether or not it didn't end up working out in the end, you still saw that there was the potential for that. Right. So on that note, Jon, you had mentioned that you kind of saw this call to action around entrepreneurship happen after Katrina. And on that note, what should startup stakeholders, say in Tucson or other cities, be working on maybe individually or as groups to help attract, grow, or propel these kind of high growth startups? Like what do you do to go all in on those 1, 2, 3 companies?
Yeah, so I'm a little biased in this answer, but I think what the core of what we do today is run an accelerator program. And I think that tool is incredibly valuable because it allows you to source, it allows you to vet, and it allows you to pour resources into those types of companies, right? And so and it becomes a sort of focal point and rallying point for the broader community. So we sort of try to take folks from relative obscurity, put them through the process, get them to the point where they're really viable, and then sort of hand them off to the private sector community. And I would say the second, actually, this is from the previous question, that second tipping point is when the resources around those companies start to specialize, right? That's a major tipping point, as well as when you can really get to a group of people that are specializing in high growth startups. And oftentimes you have to import those. So in New Orleans, we have a lot of expats, people that were either born in New Orleans or have lived in New Orleans for some period of time and have moved away, but have a love of the city. And so that was a group that we tapped into early on and continue to tap into for that sort of specialized expertise that you may not have on the ground at the beginning.
Great. I think that segues really well into one of Amanda's questions. Amanda, do you want to ask your question around the talent pipeline, or do you want me to ask it?
Oh yeah, I can ask it. Yeah, I was just wondering, I think you had mentioned a little bit earlier on in your talk about kind of having a pipeline. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that looks like and how you support kind of like the farming rather than the attraction.
Yeah. Yeah, so our our overall pipeline starts with community building. So just like I've heard is happening in Tucson, we have a major event we call New Orleans Entrepreneur Week. That is kind of big front door and neon sign for get involved in this type of work. From that, we dive into more kind of direct, what I would call catalyst programming, things like we call it 48-hour launch, but effectively startup weekends. We've also partnered with some larger companies to kind of pre-identify problem sets and source either projects or startups that are responding to that particular problem set. And so that can be another kind of catalyst or formation mechanism that feeds folks into the pipeline. Can also be a rallying point for attraction, as where those might come from a little bit broader region. And then we have a pre-accelerator program that's really about the skills development. And so it's more about the person than it is about the company. It's very heavy on kind of opportunity recognition and like how do you identify and evaluate startup and entrepreneurial opportunities? How do you build the kind of entrepreneurial mindset? And then how do you test and validate whether there's something there or not? And so that is kind of the idea to validated business model sort of program. And then from there, that's really where our core accelerator would pick up. That's much more mentorship driven, custom plan, and sort of built around that seed to Series A idea.
Thanks, Jon. It's so funny that you're like, as you're outlining this, I'm just thinking of how our ecosystem is modeling some of the same things. Like Dre and I are smiling a lot because we have 10 West and idea funding, and then we have our fundamental series that is very similar to what you're describing as your pre-accelerator. And then we have UACI and Forge that are our incubators and accelerators. So we're earlier in our process, we're younger as an organization, we're younger as an ecosystem, but Tucson is kind of modeling a lot of what Idea Village is working on. So that makes us all happy that we're starting to build some momentum in the right direction. Our last question that we ask every Innovation Economics, which is the second one, so it's a new last question. But what is your favorite story of entrepreneurial success, and what do you attribute this success to?
Oh, that's a tough one. Favorite story that I'm sort of part of in New Orleans, or favorite story?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
It can be your favorite founder, your favorite company that's grown. It can be Idea Village's story. Just kind of what's your favorite success story, and then what do you attribute that to? That is maybe a lesson we can learn from.
Cool. So I'm incredibly inspired by my outgoing board chair is the CEO of Lucid, which is our big success story for New Orleans. And his story is really interesting. He started as a graduated college as a theater major, happened to find his way into tech. I think he was like making sets for something and there was a tech problem, and so he got tapped to do that and sort of taught himself on the fly, and then ended up with getting a job in the market research industry, just unrelated, as needing a job, and then that sort of put all those things together into what became Lucid. And so I think the lesson in that is where you start is not always where you end. And that sort of diversity of experiences is what actually makes a great startup founder. Yes,
love that lesson. That's a great one. We've also been talking a lot about how your startup's not your baby. So sometimes you need to be open to your first idea or your first exact solution to the problem maybe isn't the one that's gonna take off and get the traction. So be open to all of those experiences and those stories as they come in so that you can really solve a true problem. So I think that tracks with a lot of what we've been talking about with our community. Well, with that, thank you so much, Jon, for spending some time with us today. Thank you, everyone that's been here on the call, Startup Tucson team. It has been a really, really great conversation today, and we look forward to seeing all of you at the next Innovation Economics and to talking to you soon, Jon.
Awesome. Thank you all for having me.
Thanks, guys.